Have you ever noticed how the brightest smiles sometimes belong to the people carrying the heaviest burdens? There's something strange about the friend who's always the life of the party, always cracking jokes, always telling you everything's fine, until one day, they're not. And you realize you never really knew what was happening beneath the surface. We've all encountered them. Maybe you've even been one of them. The person who wraps their pain in laughter, who transforms their exhaustion into enthusiasm, who carefully constructs a facade of joy while something inside them quietly fractures. But here's the question that haunts this experience. Why do some people find it easier to pretend happiness than to simply exist as they are? Let's start with what you can see. The performance of happiness is an art form, really. It's in the way someone's voice rises just a little too high when they say they're doing great. It's in the laugh that comes half a second too late. It's in the constant reassurance that everything is perfect, wonderful, couldn't be better repeated so often it starts to sound like a mantra, or maybe a prayer. You know what I'm talking about. You've felt it in conversations that somehow never go deeper than the surface. You've sensed it in the friend who asks how you're doing, but deflects the moment you return the question. You've witnessed it in the person who fills every silence with noise, as if quiet itself is dangerous. And here's the thing, these people aren't liars. They're not manipulators. They're survivors. And the psychology behind their performance runs deeper than most of us realize. So what creates this pattern? What makes someone choose the exhausting work of pretending over the vulnerability of truth? The answer often begins in childhood. Attachment theory tells us that we learn how to handle emotions based on how our caregivers responded to us. If your tears were met with impatience, if your sadness made the adults around you uncomfortable, if you learned that love was conditional on your ability to be easy, pleasant, uncomplicated, well, you learned something profound. You learned that your real emotions were too much, too heavy, too inconvenient. And so you learned to hide them. Child psychologist Donald Winnicott called this the development of a false self, a protective persona we construct to be acceptable to others while burying our authentic experience. The child becomes the performer. The teenager becomes the people pleaser. The adult becomes the person who's always fine, always positive, always holding it together. But here's what's really happening beneath that performance. They're not pretending because they want to deceive you. They're pretending because somewhere along the way, they learned that their real self wasn't safe to show. And this is where it gets complex. Because pretending to be happy isn't just about fooling others, it's about the intricate ways we try to fool ourselves. There's a psychological mechanism called emotional suppression, and it's more sophisticated than you might think. When you consistently push down difficult emotions, something fascinating happens in your brain. The neural pathways associated with emotional expression begin to weaken. Your ability to identify what you're actually feeling becomes impaired. You don't just hide your pain from others, you start to lose access to it yourself. Psychologists call this alexithymia, the inability to identify and describe emotions. And for people who've spent years pretending to be happy, this becomes their reality. Ask them how they're really doing, and they genuinely might not know. The mask has been worn so long it started to fuse with the face beneath it. But the body keeps score, always. Bessel van der Kolk's research on trauma shows us that emotions we don't express don't simply disappear, they get stored in the body. That chronic tension in your shoulders, the unexplained fatigue, the headaches that no doctor can quite explain, the immune system that seems perpetually compromised. These are the ways your body speaks the truths your mouth refuses to say. The person pretending to be happy isn't just emotionally exhausted, they're often physically depleted in ways they can't quite name. Let's talk about the social dimension of this, because it's crucial. We live in a culture that's deeply uncomfortable with negative emotions. Think about it. When someone asks, "How are you?" they're not really asking. They're performing a social ritual that expects one answer: "Good, thanks." What happens when you break that script? When you actually tell someone you're struggling? You can almost see them recalibrate, searching for the exit, preparing their advice, or worse, their comparison about how they have it harder. Social media has amplified this to an almost unbearable degree. We curate our lives into highlight reels, carefully filtering out anything that doesn't project success, happiness, aesthetic perfection, and we scroll through everyone else's curated performances, feeling inadequate because we're comparing their public mask to our private reality. Here's the truth. The person who pretends to be happy has learned, through countless micro-rejections, that their authentic experience is unwelcome. They've offered vulnerability and had it met with discomfort, dismissal, or advice they didn't ask for, so they stopped offering it. They learned that people prefer the performance. But there's something else happening too, something that reveals the deep empathy often present in people who hide their pain. They're protecting others from their burden. They genuinely believe their struggles would be too much for the people around them to handle. They've internalized the message that their needs are excessive, their emotions are overwhelming, their problems would drain the people they love. So they shoulder it all alone, smiling through the weight of it, believing this is somehow noble, believing this is somehow love. And this is where it gets really interesting because the paradox deepens the longer this pattern continues. Neuroscience research on mirror neurons shows us that humans are wired for emotional contagion. We literally feel what others feel through these specialized brain cells that fire both when we experience an emotion and when we observe it in others. This is the biological basis of empathy, the reason we tear up when we see someone cry, the way laughter spreads through a room. But here's what happens when someone is constantly performing happiness while experiencing pain. You create a dissonance that others can sense, even if they can't name it. Something feels off. The smile doesn't quite reach the eyes. The enthusiasm feels hollow, and the people around them, especially those who love them, begin to feel an unnamed anxiety, a sense that something's wrong but they can't access what it is. The person pretending to be happy often wonders why their relationships feel superficial, why intimacy feels impossible, why they can feel lonely in a crowded room. But how can you feel truly connected when no one knows who you really are? When every interaction is based on a version of yourself that doesn't actually exist? The tragic irony is this: in trying to protect their relationships by hiding their pain, they make genuine connection impossible. Let's go deeper into what this does to someone's sense of self over time. There's a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension that arises when your actions don't align with your beliefs or internal reality. When you feel devastated but act delighted, when you're exhausted but project endless energy, when you're barely holding on but insist everything's perfect, that dissonance becomes a constant hum of psychological distress. Your brain is trying to reconcile two incompatible truths simultaneously, and over time, something has to give. Sometimes what gives is your grip on your own reality. You start to question whether your pain is legitimate. Maybe you are just being dramatic. Maybe everyone else really does have it together. Maybe you're weak for struggling with things that others handle with ease. The pretending becomes so convincing that you gaslight yourself, dismissing your own experience as invalid. Other times, what gives is the ability to pretend. The facade cracks. The performance becomes unsustainable. And this is often when people finally reach out for help, not in a moment of gentle self-awareness, but in a moment of complete collapse. The breaking point arrives, and suddenly all those people who thought you were fine are shocked. They never saw it coming. How could they? You were so good at hiding it. But here's what's fascinating about the psychology of pretending to be happy. It's not just about pain, avoidance, or people-pleasing. There's often a deeper, more philosophical dimension to it. Many people who engage in this pattern have a profound fear of being a burden, not just a casual discomfort with inconveniencing others, but a deep, existential terror that their very existence is too much, that their needs are excessive, that they take up too much space in a world that would be better off if they required less. This often connects to what psychologists call toxic positivity, the belief that we should maintain a positive mindset regardless of circumstances, that negative emotions are failures of perspective rather than valid responses to difficult situations. People who've internalized this framework don't just hide their pain from others, they judge themselves harshly for experiencing it at all. They become their own cruelest critics, demanding an impossible standard of constant positivity resilience, and emotional control. And underneath all of this, often there's a quiet, devastating belief that they are only lovable when they are easy. That affection is something they must earn through their lack of needs, their ability to be low maintenance, their skill at never being too much. Love, in this framework, is something you deserve only when you're happy, or at least when you pretend to be. So what happens when someone has spent years, maybe decades, perfecting this performance? The psychological research on emotional suppression shows us some sobering truths. Chronic suppression of emotion is linked to increased anxiety, depression, and even physical health problems, including cardiovascular disease. When you consistently deny your internal experience, your stress response system becomes chronically activated. Your body is constantly on high alert, trying to manage emotions you refuse to acknowledge. But there's something else too, something that speaks to the quiet tragedy of this pattern. People who habitually pretend to be happy often experience what's called emotional numbing. It's not just that they struggle to feel and express negative emotions, they also lose access to positive ones. The joy becomes as performative as the pain is hidden. They're not actually experiencing the happiness they're projecting. They're just going through the motions, checking the boxes, saying the right things. They become strangers to themselves, and the life they're living starts to feel like it belongs to someone else. The therapist's office is full of people who have achieved everything they thought would make them happy: the career, the relationship, the lifestyle, and yet they feel nothing. Or worse, they feel empty. Because they've spent so long performing happiness that they've forgotten what genuine contentment even feels like. But here's where we need to shift the narrative, because there's something important that needs to be said to anyone who recognizes themselves in this pattern. The fact that you learn to pretend, to perform, to protect others from your pain, that wasn't a failure. That was survival. You developed these strategies because at some point they worked. They kept you safe. They helped you navigate an environment that wasn't equipped to handle your full emotional reality. You're not broken for having learned this. You're adaptive. You're resilient. You read your environment accurately and responded in a way that protected you. The question isn't, why am I like this? The question is, do these strategies still serve me? Are they protecting me? Or are they preventing me from living fully? Because here's the truth that might be hard to hear. You can't selectively numb emotions. When you shut down sadness, you also diminish joy. When you refuse to be vulnerable with your pain, you make it impossible to be truly seen in your happiness. Emotions are a package deal. You can't cherry pick which ones you feel. The path forward isn't about suddenly spilling your guts to everyone you meet. It's not about abandoning all boundaries or making your pain everyone else's problem. It's about slowly, carefully, learning to let yourself be human, to let yourself have needs, to let yourself take up space. If you're someone who pretends to be happy, here's what I want you to know. Your pain is not too much. Your needs are not excessive. Your struggles do not make you unworthy of love. The people who truly care about you don't want a performance. They want you, the messy, complicated, sometimes struggling you. And yes, that means some people might fall away when you stop pretending. Those are the people who were only comfortable with your mask, not with your humanity. That's not a loss. That's clarity. Real connection requires real revelation. It requires the courage to let someone see you when you're not okay. To say, I'm struggling, without immediately following it with, but it's fine. It requires trusting that you are worthy of care, even when you're not at your best. And maybe, just maybe, it requires accepting that happiness isn't something you should have to perform. Real joy is quieter than the performance. It's more subtle. It doesn't require constant proclamation. It exists in moments of genuine peace, of authentic laughter, of connection that doesn't demand you be anything other than what you are. The journey from pretending to authenticity isn't a straight line. There will be moments when the old patterns reassert themselves, when you catch yourself performing again, when vulnerability feels impossible, and the mask feels safer. That's okay. This is deep work. You're rewiring neural pathways that have been reinforced for years, maybe decades. You're challenging beliefs about your worthiness that were formed when you were too young to question them. You're learning a new language, the language of your own authentic emotional experience. Be patient with yourself. Be gentle. The person who learned to pretend to be happy did so out of profound necessity. Honor that. Thank that part of yourself for keeping you safe when you needed it. And then, when you're ready, begin the quiet revolution of letting yourself be real. Because here's what happens when you stop pretending. You discover who was really there for you all along. You find out which relationships can hold your full humanity. You learn that you're capable of more resilience, more depth, more authenticity than you ever imagined. You stop living someone else's version of your life and start inhabiting your own. The masks we wear to protect ourselves eventually become the prisons that confine us. And the key to that prison has been in your hand all along. It's the terrifying, liberating choice to simply be honest. To say, I'm not okay when you're not okay. To let your face show what your heart feels. To stop performing happiness and start pursuing it genuinely. Your real emotions are not your enemy. They're the map back to yourself. And maybe that's the real happiness worth finding. Not the performance of it, but the genuine experience of being alive, being human, being exactly who you are. Pain and joy and everything in between. You don't have to pretend anymore. You never really had to. You were always enough, exactly as you are.